My name is Elara Whitcomb, and before anyone ever argued over ownership, before lawyers became involved, before my sister told me to leave, that house was simply home. People often assume family conflicts begin with one dramatic moment. In my experience, they begin much earlier. They begin in hundreds of small moments that seem insignificant when they happen. A favor here, an excuse there, a pattern nobody wants to acknowledge. My younger sister, Marin, was the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. She was charming, confident, and naturally good at telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Growing up, our parents adored her ability to make everyone smile. I was different. I preferred listening to talking. I liked routines, responsibilities, and quiet evenings. While Marin attracted attention, I avoided it whenever possible. The problem wasn't that my parents loved Marin. The problem was that they often treated her happiness as more important than everyone else's. When we were children, it looked harmless. If Marin forgot her homework, somebody rushed to help her. If I forgot mine, I was told to be more responsible. If Marin broke a rule, she was having a difficult day. If I made the same mistake, I knew better and should have done better. None of these moments felt large enough to complain about individually. Together, however, they created a family story that followed us into adulthood. Marin was special. Elara was dependable. Special people were protected. Dependable people were expected to handle everything. The older we became, the stronger those roles grew. By the time we reached our 30s, nobody questioned them anymore. Then our mother became sick. At first, the changes were subtle. She forgot appointments. She repeated stories she had told only hours earlier. She misplaced bills and blamed herself for becoming distracted. The doctors eventually confirmed what we feared. She would need help. A lot of help. Our father had passed away years earlier, which left the responsibility largely to us. Everyone immediately assumed we would both contribute equally. That assumption lasted about 3 weeks. Marin lived less than 40 minutes away, but somehow she always had a reason she couldn't come. Work was stressful. Her friends needed her. She had plans. She wasn't feeling well. Something always came up. Meanwhile, I found myself driving to the house almost every day. I organized medications. I attended medical appointments. I cooked meals. I cleaned rooms. I handled insurance paperwork. I spoke with doctors. I sat beside my mother during long nights when she couldn't sleep. I never kept score. At least not at first. I loved my mother, and helping her felt natural. But after months turned into years, I started noticing something. Whenever relatives visited, Marin received praise for being a caring daughter. People spoke about how difficult the situation must be for her. Meanwhile, I was standing in the kitchen washing dishes. The person actually doing the work had become invisible. One afternoon, my mother quietly apologized while I helped her fold laundry. "You've given up so much for me," she said. I smiled and told her not to worry about it. But she looked at me carefully. "No, Elara, I see it." That conversation stayed with me, not because I needed recognition, because it was one of the few times someone openly acknowledged reality. As her condition worsened, I made additional sacrifices. I turned down a promotion that would have required relocating. I reduced my work hours. I used vacation days for medical appointments instead of vacations. Friends encouraged me to focus more on my own life. Sometimes I wondered if they were right. But every time I considered stepping back, I would see my mother's face and remember why I stayed. The house became the center of everything. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even particularly valuable compared to other homes in the area. What made it important was what it represented. Every holiday meal, every birthday, every family photograph hanging in the hallway. Every memory was attached to those walls. That was why I worked so hard to preserve it. I believed I was protecting our family's history. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way. As the years passed, relatives began casually discussing what would happen someday. The conversations usually happened during holidays. Someone would mention inheritance. Someone else would mention the house. And almost every time, people assumed Marin would receive it. "She's always loved this place. Your mother has a special bond with her. Marin will probably end up owning it." The comments became so common that nobody questioned them, including me. I never asked my mother about her plans. Honestly, I didn't want to. The idea felt uncomfortable. She was still alive. Discussing inheritance felt wrong, so I ignored the comments and focused on helping her. Looking back now, I realized something important. Assumptions become dangerous when they are repeated often enough. Eventually, people stop treating them like guesses. They start treating them like facts. Marin certainly did. The first time I noticed her entitlement was after one family barbecue. Most of our relatives had already left. Only a few of us remained on the back porch. Marin looked around the property and smiled. One day I'll probably renovate this entire place. The statement caught me off guard. Our mother was sitting only a few feet away. Yet Marin spoke as though ownership had already been decided. Nobody corrected her. Nobody even looked surprised. Our mother simply watched quietly. At the time, I dismissed the moment. Now I wish I had paid closer attention. Because it wasn't really a comment about renovations. It was a glimpse into what Marin believed she deserved. Several months later, while helping my mother organize old paperwork, she pointed toward an antique desk in the study. The desk had belonged to my grandmother. It contained decades of letters, receipts, photographs, and documents. Most people ignored it. My mother didn't. If anything ever seems confusing, she said softly, look carefully before believing what you're told. I remember laughing. That sounds mysterious. She smiled. Maybe it is. Then she changed the subject. At the time, I thought she was simply being sentimental. I had no idea those words would eventually become one of the most important warnings of my life. Because while everyone else was building stories about ownership, promises, and future inheritance, something else was quietly waiting. A piece of paper, a legal document, a truth hidden in plain sight. And before long, that truth would force my entire family to confront everything they thought they knew. The day my sister threw me out of the house began like any other. I arrived carrying groceries. For months after our mother's funeral, I had continued stopping by several times each week. Part of it was habit. Part of it was grief. The house still felt connected to her in ways I couldn't explain. When I pulled into the driveway, something immediately felt wrong. A moving truck sat near the garage. Several unfamiliar cars lined the curb. The front door stood open. People were carrying furniture through the living room. For a moment, I wondered whether I had somehow forgotten about a family gathering. Then I saw Marin. She stood in the entryway holding a clipboard, directing workers as if she owned the place. What's going on? I asked. She barely looked at me. We're making some changes. The answer made no sense. What kind of changes? The kind that should have happened years ago. I stared at her. The tone in her voice was different, colder, more confident than I had ever heard. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I set the grocery bags down. Marin, what exactly is happening? Finally, she turned toward me. I think it's time we stopped pretending. I felt my pulse quicken. Pretending what? That this house belongs to both of us. For several seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. Then she continued. Mom always intended this house for me. The words landed like a slap. I looked around the room, expecting someone to laugh or explain. Nobody did. A few relatives avoided eye contact. Others suddenly seemed fascinated by their phones. The silence made everything worse. You don't get to decide that, I said carefully. Marin folded her arms. Actually, I do. I asked what legal document gave her that authority. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she repeated something I would hear many times over the following weeks. Everybody knows what Mom wanted. Everybody. Not a lawyer. Not a deed. Not a will. Everybody. The conversation quickly turned into an argument. For the first time in our lives, my sister spoke to me as though I were an outsider. As though I had simply wandered into someone else's property. Every sacrifice I had made. Every appointment. Every sleepless night. Every year spent helping our mother. None of it seemed to matter anymore. Marin had already rewritten history. And somehow other people were allowing her to do it. The next few days became a blur. Phone calls, text messages, family opinions, unsolicited advice. Relatives who had barely visited our mother suddenly felt qualified to explain what she would have wanted. The most painful part wasn't Marin's behavior. It was discovering how quickly people accepted her version of events. One aunt called me. Maybe you should just let this go. Another relative suggested that fighting would only divide the family. A cousin told me that peace was more important than property. Nobody seemed interested in asking whether Marin was actually right. They simply wanted the conflict to disappear. And because I had always been the dependable one, they expected me to be the person who sacrificed again. Then things became even worse. 3 days later, I arrived at the house to collect several boxes from my old bedroom. My key didn't work. At first, I assumed the lock was damaged. I tried again. Nothing. Then I noticed the new hardware. The locks had been replaced. I stood on the porch staring at the door. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't a family disagreement. Someone had deliberately locked me out. I knocked. Marin opened the door a minute later. She looked annoyed rather than surprised. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't believe she was asking. "My key doesn't work." "That's because I changed the locks." The casual way she said it made my chest tighten.
"You changed the locks?"
"Yes, you locked me out?" "I secured my property." "Her property?" Again, the same assumption, the same certainty, as though repeating it enough times would somehow make it true. I asked for my belongings. She told me to arrange a pickup time later. Then she closed the door. Right in my face. I remained on the porch for several minutes, not because I expected her to reopen the door. Because I genuinely couldn't understand how we had reached this point. The sister I grew up with had always been selfish. But this felt different, calculated, confident, as though she believed she had already won. That evening I returned to my apartment feeling emotionally exhausted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was confused. Something about the situation didn't fit. Marin was acting with absolute certainty. Yet I had never seen any legal proof, no will, no transfer paperwork, no official documents, nothing, just assumptions. Family stories and confidence. While sorting through several storage boxes that night, I searched for old financial records. I wasn't even sure what I hoped to find. Mostly I wanted facts, something concrete, something real. Hours later, buried beneath tax returns and insurance papers, I discovered an old folder. The same folder I vaguely remembered helping my mother organize years earlier. Dust covered the edges. The label had faded. I almost ignored it. Then I remembered the conversation about my grandmother's desk. Look carefully before believing what you're told. The memory stopped me. I opened the folder. Inside were several documents I didn't immediately recognize. Most appeared legal: property records, correspondence, copies of filings. Near the bottom sat a single page containing information that instantly caught my attention. One name stood out. My name, not Marin's. Mine, and for the first time since being thrown out of the house, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Because whatever that document meant, it suggested there was a part of this story nobody had bothered to tell me. And I intended to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise with that folder sitting on my kitchen table. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name printed on that page. Not handwritten, not scribbled in a margin. Printed in the middle of language that looked formal enough to matter and confusing enough to frighten me. I made coffee and read the document again. Then again. The more I read, the less certain I became. There were dates, parcel numbers, references to recording information, and names I recognized from years earlier. My mother's name appeared in one place. My grandmother's name appeared in another. Mine appeared near the bottom. Marin's did not appear anywhere. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made me cautious. A single document does not tell the whole truth. I knew enough about life to understand that paperwork could be outdated, incomplete, or misunderstood. I was not going to storm back into the house waving something I did not fully understand. That was exactly the kind of thing Marin would have done. I needed facts. So at 9 o'clock, I called the county recorder's office. The woman who answered sounded kind but busy. I explained that I was trying to confirm current ownership records for a residential property and gave her the address. She told me property records were public and that I could search online, but if I wanted certified copies, I would need to come in or submit a formal request. 20 minutes later, I was in my car. The county office sat inside a plain brick building downtown, the kind of place people passed without thinking about the life-changing information stored inside. Birth records, deeds, liens, transfers, quiet paper trails that outlasted arguments. I took a number and waited. When my turn came, I slid the address across the counter. "I need the most recent deed history for this property," I said. The clerk typed for several seconds. Her expression did not change, but mine probably did. Because after she printed the first record and turned it toward me, the timeline immediately looked different from everything my family had been saying. The property had not simply remained in my mother's name until her death. There had been a transfer years earlier. A quiet one. A recorded one. I stared at the date. I remembered that year clearly. It was the year my mother's health had declined enough that I started staying overnight 2 or 3 times a week. It was also the year Marin began telling relatives that Mom was getting confused. Whenever Mom said something Marin did not like. At the time, I thought Marin was being dramatic. Now I wondered if she had been trying to make people doubt our mother before our mother's decisions could be questioned. "Can I get a certified copy of this?" I asked. The clerk nodded. "Do you also want the prior deed?" "Yes," I said quickly. "Everything connected to the transfer." She printed several pages. With each page, the story my family had built began to wobble. The house had moved from my grandmother to my mother years earlier. That made sense. But the later transfer changed everything. There was a line I kept reading over and over. Grantee Elara Whitcomb. My full legal name. I felt my hands go cold. I asked whether the record meant what I thought. She gave me the careful expression of someone who had been trained not to give legal advice. "I can't interpret it for you," she said. "But this is what was recorded with the county." Recorded, not promised, not assumed, not whispered around a Thanksgiving table. Recorded. That word followed me back to my car. I sat there with the certified copies on my lap and thought about all the times relatives had said everyone knew what my mother wanted. Maybe everyone had known what Marin wanted. That was not the same thing. Still, I needed someone qualified. I went home and searched through old emails until I found the name of the attorney who had helped my mother after my grandmother died. His name was Douglas Renner. I remembered him vaguely from one meeting years earlier. Silver hair, calm voice, careful questions. I found his office number and called. His receptionist asked what the matter concerned. "Property records," I said, "possibly estate planning." My mother was his client. There was a pause when I gave my mother's name. Then the receptionist's voice softened. "Let me check with Mr. Renner." I expected to be told to make an appointment weeks later. Instead, she came back on the line and said he could speak with me briefly that afternoon. That told me something. At 3 o'clock, I sat in his office with the folder on my lap and my stomach tied into knots. Douglas Renner looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. He let me explain the funeral, Marin's claims, the changed locks, and the document I had found. When I placed the certified deed copies on his desk, he put on his glasses. For several minutes, he said nothing. The silence there almost broke me. He leaned back. "Where did you get these?" "The recorder's office." "Good," he said. "Then you have certified public records. Do they mean the house is mine?" He looked at me carefully. "Based on what I'm seeing here, the property was transferred to you by deed during your mother's lifetime." My mouth went dry. "So Marin cannot just claim it?" "No," he said. "Not because relatives assumed something. Not because she wanted it. Not because she says your mother intended it. If this deed is valid and properly recorded, ownership does not pass through family opinion." I looked at my hands. For weeks, I had felt like the unreasonable one, the difficult one. The daughter refusing to accept what everyone else had already decided. Now a stranger in a law office was calmly explaining that I had not imagined the problem. There had been a truth beneath all the noise. "Mr. Renner opened a file cabinet behind him and pulled out a storage box. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Your mother was not confused when she made this decision." The sentence hit me harder than I expected, because Marin had implied that for years. That mom was forgetful. That mom was emotional. That mom did not understand complicated matters anymore. But according to the attorney, the transfer had been planned carefully. He had notes, correspondence, identification records, capacity confirmation, documentation showing that my mother understood what she was doing. She was worried about conflict after her death, he said. She wanted the property protected before probate became an issue. Probate. That word made another piece click into place. If the house had already been legally transferred before my mother died, then it would not simply be divided through her estate the way my relatives assumed. Marin had been arguing over an inheritance that might not exist. At least not where the house was concerned. I asked whether Marin could challenge it. "She can try," he said. "People can challenge almost anything. But trying and having a valid claim are different matters." That sounded like my family in one sentence. Trying, claiming, pressuring, repeating a story until everyone became tired enough to accept it. Mr. Renner asked if I still had access to the house. I told him about the locks. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "You need to be careful from this point forward," he said. "Do not force entry. Do not argue on the porch. Do not threaten her. We will handle this formally." "We?" He gave a small nod. "If you want representation." "Yes." For the first time in days, I felt my breathing steady. Not because the fight was over. Because I was no longer standing alone in the middle of family pressure with nothing but my memory and hurt feelings. I had records. I had dates. I had a lawyer who remembered my mother. And I had something else my sister had not counted on. Patience. Before I left, Mr. Renner made copies and asked me to return the following afternoon. He said there were additional documents in storage that might explain why my mother made the transfer. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. A message from Marin. You need to stop dragging this out. Come get your things Saturday. After that, I'm donating whatever is left. I read it twice. Then I looked at the certified deed in my folder. For the first time, her threat did not scare me. It confirmed something. Marin was rushing because she believed speed would become power. But paper moves differently than panic. And somewhere in Mr. Renner's storage files, I had a feeling my mother had left behind the one thing Marin feared most. An explanation. I arrived at Douglas Renner's office, 15 minutes early. Normally, I hated being early. That day, I could not sit still. The previous 24 hours had changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my mother, and the house. Yet, I still felt as though I was standing in the middle of a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The deed explained ownership. It did not explain why my mother had kept it secret. It did not explain why she never told me directly. And it certainly did not explain how Marin had become so convinced the house belonged to her. When Mr. Renner entered the conference room, carrying a thick file box, I immediately knew the answers would not be simple. He set the box on the table. This belonged to your mother's estate file. I stared at it. Years of paperwork sat inside. Letters, notes, copies of documents, signed forms, records of meetings, a person's intentions preserved on paper. Mr. Renner opened the box carefully. Your mother was extremely organized. That made me smile despite everything. That sounds like her. It does, he agreed. He removed several folders and spread them across the table. Then he pointed toward a document dated almost 7 years earlier. This was the beginning. The document outlined a property transfer strategy. The house had been transferred while my mother was alive. Not after her death. Not through a will. Not through probate. Not through inheritance. Through a legally executed deed. I read every page twice, then a third time. Each reading made the truth clearer. My mother had intentionally removed the house from her future estate. That decision had not happened by accident. It had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. Years before anyone expected her health to decline. Years before the funeral. Years before the family arguments. Years before Marin changed the locks. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Mr. Renner opened another folder, because she believed conflict was coming. The answer settled heavily in the room. Conflict. My mother had seen it long before I did. He handed me several pages containing notes from their meetings. Most were straightforward. Property discussions, financial planning, routine legal matters. Then I reached a page containing handwritten comments. My mother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Tears filled my eyes before I finished the first paragraph. She had written about the house. Not its value, not its market price. Its meaning. The garden she planted. The repairs she and my father completed together. The family memories connected to every room. Then she wrote something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Alara protected this home when nobody else wanted the responsibility. I read the sentence again. And again. For years I had wondered whether my sacrifices mattered. For years I had assumed nobody noticed. Apparently, my mother noticed everything. The file contained additional notes, descriptions of doctor's appointments I attended, maintenance projects I completed, insurance issues I handled, repairs I paid for when money was tight, small acts I barely remembered. She remembered them all. While the rest of the family saw obligation, my mother saw commitment. While others saw routine, she saw loyalty. Mr. Renner allowed me several minutes to read quietly. When I finally looked up, my eyes were wet. She never told me. No, he said gently. Why not? He hesitated. Then he opened another folder. Inside sat a letter. Not addressed to me. Not addressed to anyone. A memorandum summarizing a private meeting. According to the notes, my mother had specifically discussed keeping the transfer confidential. The reason stunned me. She believed telling me would create pressure. Pressure from relatives. Pressure from Marin. Pressure to share ownership. Pressure to reverse her decision. She feared family conflict would begin immediately. So she chose silence. Not because she doubted her choice. Because she wanted to protect it. I sat quietly absorbing that. For years I had interpreted her silence as uncertainty. The reality was exactly the opposite. She had been completely certain. That certainty became even clearer when Mr. Renner produced another document. A letter from Marin. My stomach tightened. Years earlier, Marin had contacted the attorney directly. The letter was polite, carefully written, almost professional, but the message was obvious. She wanted clarification regarding future ownership of the property. Mr. Renner showed me his response. Professional, brief, noncommittal. He had refused to discuss private estate matters. Then he handed me another note. A meeting summary. Apparently, after receiving that response, Marin had attempted to raise the issue with our mother, and she had been told no. Not vaguely. Not indirectly. Directly. My mother had informed her that decisions regarding the property were final. I stared at the page. The realization hit me like cold water. Marin knew. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the exact legal structure, but she knew enough to understand she was not automatically receiving the house. The confidence she displayed after the funeral suddenly looked very different. It wasn't certainty. It was entitlement. She had spent years convincing herself that reality would eventually adjust to match her expectations. When reality failed to cooperate, she simply ignored it. The pattern felt painfully familiar. Growing up, rules often bent around Marin. Consequences often disappeared. Responsibilities often shifted elsewhere. The difference now was that legal documents could not be manipulated the way family members could. A deed did not care who cried louder. A deed did not care who relatives favored. A deed did not care about family narratives. A deed cared about facts, and the facts were becoming impossible to ignore. Mr. Renner eventually opened one final folder. This is the most important document. Inside sat a sealed letter. My name appeared on the front. Nothing else. Just my name. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter was written entirely in my mother's handwriting, several pages long. I recognized every curve of every letter. For a moment, it felt as though she were sitting beside me again. The first paragraph nearly broke me. If you're reading this, then something happened exactly the way I feared it might. I had to stop. The room blurred. After a few moments, I continued. She explained that she had spent years observing our family dynamics. She understood the expectations placed upon me. She understood the favoritism. She understood the assumptions people made about Marin. Most importantly, she understood who had actually protected the house. The letter never criticized my sister. That wasn't my mother's style. Instead, she described actions, responsibilities, choices, patterns, and those patterns told the story themselves. Near the end, she wrote something I would never forget. A home belongs to the person who cares for it when nobody is watching, not the person who claims it when everyone is. By the time I finished reading, I was crying openly. Not because of the property, not because of the legal victory. Because for the first time in my life, I felt completely seen. Years of quiet effort. Years of sacrifice. Years of being overlooked. My mother had noticed all of it, and she had acted accordingly. When I finally composed myself, Mr. Renner slid another document across the table, a certified copy of the recorded deed, the final piece, the missing piece, the undeniable piece. The house belonged to me, legally, documented, recorded, protected. No family vote could change that. No emotional manipulation could change that. No amount of entitlement could change that. I placed the deed back into my folder. The same folder I had nearly ignored. The same folder that now contained the truth. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Marin. Saturday. Final pickup? Don't make this difficult. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I looked at the deed. For the first time, I almost smiled, because Saturday was only 2 days away. And very soon, my sister was going to see something she never expected. The document she spent years pretending did not exist. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of warm weather my mother used to love. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in Douglas Renner's office reviewing the final documents one last time. The certified deed, the transfer records, the supporting paperwork, copies of correspondence. Everything was organized inside a neat leather portfolio. Mr. Renner believed preparation mattered, especially when emotions were involved. Family conflicts, he explained, often became messy because people argued feelings instead of facts. Today, we would be bringing facts. What happens if she refuses to accept it? I asked. He closed his briefcase. Whether she accepts it or not doesn't change ownership. The simplicity of that answer felt strangely comforting. For weeks, I had been trapped inside arguments. Arguments about intentions. Arguments about assumptions. Arguments about what people believed. The law worked differently. Ownership either existed or it didn't, and according to every document we possessed, it existed. At 11 o'clock, we arrived at the house. The driveway was full, much fuller than I expected. Cars lined both sides of the street. Music drifted through open windows. People moved around the backyard. For a moment, I thought we had come on the wrong day. Then I remembered something Marin had posted online earlier that week. A celebration. A fresh start. A new chapter. Apparently, she had decided to host a gathering. In a house she believed was hers. I almost laughed at the timing. Mr. Renner raised an eyebrow. Looks like we have an audience. He wasn't wrong. Nearly every relative who mattered seemed to be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. People who had heard one version of the story for weeks. People who believed they already knew what happened. People who thought they understood who was right. As we walked toward the front door, several conversations stopped. Heads turned. Eyes followed us. The atmosphere changed immediately. Marin appeared in the foyer seconds later. Her smile disappeared the moment she saw me. Then she noticed Mr. Renner. The change in her expression was impossible to miss. Confusion, concern, then irritation. "What is this?" she asked. I remained calm. "Good morning, Marin." "This isn't a good morning." Mr. Renner stepped forward. "My name is Douglas Rennard." Recognition flashed across her face. She knew exactly who he was. That alone told me more than any argument ever could. For a split second, I saw uncertainty. Then she recovered. "We're in the middle of a private family gathering." "Excellent," Mr. Renner replied. "Then everyone important is already here." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Several relatives moved closer. Nobody wanted to miss what was happening. My Aunt Denise emerged from the dining room. My cousin Rachel stepped into the hallway. Even neighbors standing outside seemed curious. The gathering had suddenly transformed into something else entirely. Marin folded her arms. "If this is about your belongings, we can discuss them later." I shook my head. "No? Then what?" I looked around the room. Years of assumptions stood before me. Years of family stories. Years of favoritism. Years of people deciding who deserved what. All without ever checking whether those stories were true. I reached into the portfolio and removed the certified deed. The room became remarkably quiet. Not dramatic quiet. Confused quiet. People sensed something important but didn't yet understand what it was. Marin stared at the document. Then at me. Then back at the document. "What is that?" The confidence in her voice had already weakened. I placed the deed carefully on the dining room table. The same table where countless family dinners had taken place. The same table where people spent years discussing futures they did not understand. "This," I said calmly, "is the recorded property deed." Nobody spoke. Several relatives moved closer. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Marin did not move. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Renner opened his briefcase and produced additional copies. "The property located at this address was legally transferred during your mother's lifetime." His voice was professional. Measured, impossible to dismiss. Marin laughed, a short nervous laugh. "No." The response sounded automatic, like someone rejecting reality before fully processing it. Mr. Renner continued. "The transfer was properly executed, properly witnessed, and properly recorded with the county." Marin's face lost color. She picked up the deed. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, reading, rereading, searching, looking for something that would make the document disappear. Then she found the name. My name. The exact moment she saw it changed everything. I watched confidence leave her face, watched certainty collapse, watched years of assumptions collide with reality. For the first time since our mother died, Marin looked genuinely afraid. "No." She whispered it this time. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, as though speaking softer might somehow change the words. She flipped through additional pages, dates, signatures, recording numbers, official seals. Each page made the situation worse. Every document confirmed the previous one. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion, no technicality, only truth. Several relatives leaned over her shoulder. I watched their expressions shift one by one. Surprise, confusion, realization. My Aunt Denise covered her mouth. Rachel stared at me, then at the paperwork, then back at me again. The room felt different now. Not because anyone had spoken, because the family narrative was beginning to break apart. The story everyone accepted was no longer surviving contact with evidence. Marin looked at me, then at Mr. Renner, then back at the deed. "When did this happen?" Mr. Renner answered. "Years ago?" The room erupted with questions.
When? Why? Did Mom really do this? Was everyone aware?
People spoke over each other. Confusion spread rapidly. Because once one assumption falls, people begin questioning everything connected to it. Marin slammed the paperwork onto the table. She wouldn't do this. But even she sounded uncertain. Not angry. Uncertain. Renner calmly removed another document. My mother's letter. He placed it beside the deed. The room instantly quieted again. My mother's handwriting was recognizable to everyone. Nobody questioned that. Nobody could. Several relatives began reading. A few lines at first, then entire paragraphs. I watched faces change. The letter explained her reasoning, her concerns, her observations, her decisions. Most importantly, it explained that the transfer was intentional, not accidental, not temporary, intentional. Years of sacrifice had been noticed. Years of care had been remembered. Years of responsibility had mattered. For the first time, people weren't hearing my version. They were hearing hers. And that changed everything. Marin looked around the room, searching for support, for agreement, for someone willing to dismiss the documents. Nobody volunteered, because evidence creates a kind of silence that arguments cannot overcome. Eventually, she looked directly at me. What happens now? The question carried an irony so powerful I almost smiled. For weeks, she had acted as though all decisions belonged to her. Now she was asking me. I thought about the changed locks, the humiliation, the pressure, the relatives who urged me to surrender. Then I thought about my mother's letter, and the example she always set. I kept my voice calm. What happens now is that we follow the law. No shouting. No insults. No revenge. Just facts. The same facts she should have respected from the beginning. As conversations resumed around us, I noticed something important. People were no longer looking at me like the difficult daughter refusing to move on. They were looking at me differently, the way people look at someone whose story they finally understand. And standing in the middle of that room, watching my sister stare helplessly at the deed she never expected to see, I realized the truth had finally entered the house. And once truth arrives, it becomes very difficult to force it back out. The strangest part of justice is that it rarely arrives with the dramatic satisfaction people imagine. There was no cheering, no applause, no triumphant speech. After the deed appeared on the table, reality simply settled over the room. And reality was far more powerful than any argument. For several minutes after the confrontation, nobody seemed to know what to say. Conversations broke into small groups. Relatives studied copies of the documents. Some reread my mother's letter. Others quietly discussed details they had never bothered questioning before. The atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier that morning, people treated me like an unwanted guest. Now they were looking at me as if they had discovered an entirely different story. Marin remained near the dining room table. She barely moved. The confidence that had carried her through weeks of accusations and assumptions was gone. In its place sat something unfamiliar: consequences. Real consequences, not emotional ones, legal ones. Eventually Mr. Renner requested everyone's attention. The room slowly quieted. His voice remained calm and professional. The ownership status of this property is not in dispute. That sentence alone changed everything. Not in dispute. No debate, no family vote, no negotiation, no interpretation. The property belonged to me. Period. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. I recognized why. Many of them had spent weeks encouraging me to surrender. Many had spoken as though ownership were already settled. Now they were forced to confront a difficult truth. They had never checked the facts. They simply followed the loudest narrative. And the loudest narrative happened to be wrong. Mr. Renner continued explaining the legal situation. Because the property transfer occurred years before my mother's death, the house was not passing through probate. That meant it was not part of the estate available for distribution. No inheritance dispute existed regarding the property itself. Ownership had already been established. The explanation was simple. The implications were enormous. One uncle rubbed his forehead. Another shook his head. A cousin whispered, "I had no idea." Neither did most people. That realization seemed to spread through the room like a wave. Not because the documents were complicated, because everyone had trusted assumptions more than evidence. Marin finally spoke. "There has to be something we can do." The Mr. Renner looked at her politely. "What specifically?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, because for the first time, there was no emotional argument available. Only legal reality, and legal reality did not care about fairness as she defined it. It cared about documentation, procedure, ownership. The conversation shifted again when several relatives began approaching me individually. My Aunt Denise came first. She looked embarrassed. "I owe you an apology. I wasn't expecting that." She shook her head before I could respond. "No, let me finish." Tears formed in her eyes. I believed what I was told. The statement sounded simple, but it carried weight, because it described exactly what had happened throughout the family. People believed what they were told. not what they verified, not what they investigated, what they were told. One by one, similar conversations followed. Relatives remembered my years caring for Mom. They remembered appointments, repairs, sacrifices, contributions, things they had ignored while focusing on louder personalities. Recognition arrived slowly, not because people suddenly changed, because evidence forced them to reevaluate old assumptions. The shift felt strange. Part of me appreciated it. Part of me resented it. After all, the facts about my efforts had always existed. People simply hadn't paid attention. Now they were paying attention because paperwork confirmed what they previously overlooked. That realization hurt more than I expected. Later that afternoon, most relatives left. The gathering dissolved quietly. No celebration remained. No party atmosphere survived. Only reality. And reality had altered every relationship in the room. Before leaving, Mr. Renner reviewed next steps. The changed locks, occupancy issues, access rights, property management. Everything would be handled formally. Everything would be documented. Everything would follow legal procedure, no shortcuts. No emotional bargaining. I appreciated that approach. Family drama had created enough problems already. The last thing I wanted was more conflict. Unfortunately, conflict wasn't finished yet. 3 days later, Marin called. I almost didn't answer. Almost, but avoiding difficult conversations had never solved anything. Her voice sounded different, smaller, less certain. I want to talk. We are talking. A long silence followed. Then she asked the question I never expected. Can we work something out? The irony nearly took my breath away. Weeks earlier, she changed the locks. Weeks earlier, she ordered me off the property. Weeks earlier, compromise never crossed her mind. Now compromise suddenly mattered, not because her perspective changed, because her leverage disappeared. I listened carefully. Marin explained that moving immediately would create financial difficulties. She discussed inconvenience, expenses, timing, stress. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she acknowledge what she had done. The conversation revealed something important. She wasn't seeking reconciliation. She was seeking relief. There is a difference. And recognizing that difference protected me from making another mistake. I told her all discussions regarding occupancy would go through proper channels. Nothing more, nothing less. She became frustrated, not angry, frustrated, as though she genuinely could not understand why her wishes no longer determined outcomes. When the call ended, I felt unexpectedly calm, because something fundamental had changed. For years, I responded to family pressure. Now I responded to facts. Facts were easier. Facts didn't guilt trip. Facts didn't manipulate. Facts simply existed. Over the following weeks, formal notices were issued. Deadlines were established. Requirements were communicated. Everything remained professional. Everything remained documented. Exactly as it should have been from the beginning. My parents struggled with the new reality more than anyone expected. Part of them still wanted peace. Part of them still wanted compromise. Mostly, they wanted the problem to disappear. One evening my father asked whether I could simply allow Marin to remain indefinitely. I asked a simple question in return. Would you have asked her to let me stay? The silence that followed answered everything. He didn't need to respond. We both knew the truth. The expectations placed on me had always been different. For decades I carried responsibilities others avoided. For decades, keeping peace meant sacrificing something. My time, my energy, my opportunities, my voice. This time, keeping peace required something else. Boundaries. Real boundaries. The kind that do not disappear when someone becomes uncomfortable. As weeks passed, I noticed another unexpected consequence. The story people told about me began changing, not dramatically, gradually. Relatives stopped describing me as quiet and dependable. Instead, they described me as strong. The distinction mattered. Dependable people are expected to endure. Strong people are respected. For the first time, I felt the difference. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, I found a picture of my mother standing in the front garden. She was smiling. Sunlight illuminated her face. Looking at that photograph, I realized something. The deed was never really the victory. The recognition was. The acknowledgement, the validation, the confirmation that my sacrifices had mattered, that they had been seen, that they had been remembered. The property simply happened to be the evidence. And while legal consequences continued unfolding around us, another transformation had already begun. I was no longer fighting to prove my worth. I already had proof. The only remaining question was what kind of future I wanted to build with it. And for the first time in a very long time, that choice belonged entirely to me. Nearly 4 months after the day my sister saw the deed, I found myself sitting alone in the sunroom with a cup of coffee and my mother's letter spread across the table. The house was quiet. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference. For years, this house had been filled with obligations, doctor appointments, medication schedules, insurance calls, repair projects, endless responsibilities. Then it became a battlefield. Arguments, accusations, legal documents, family pressure. Now, for the first time in a very long time, it was simply a home again. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows. The same windows I had cleaned dozens of times while caring for my mother. The same windows she used to sit beside while reading. I unfolded her letter once more. By then I had practically memorized every sentence. Still, I read it again, slowly, carefully, not because I needed reassurance anymore, because I enjoyed hearing her voice through the words. The section that affected me most wasn't about the property. It wasn't about ownership. It wasn't even about the future. It was a single observation. She had written that people often mistake kindness for weakness. At the time she wrote it, I doubt she realized how much that sentence would eventually mean to me. Most of my life I allowed others to define me. The dependable daughter. The responsible one. The quiet one. The one who could handle it. Those labels sounded positive, but they came with a hidden cost. People assumed I would always absorb discomfort. Always compromise. Always sacrifice. Always understand. Eventually, those expectations became a prison disguised as praise. Losing the house had forced me to confront that reality. Winning it back forced me to change it. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Then I looked around the room. Every corner held a memory. Yet something about those memories felt different now. For years I carried them like obligations. Now I carried them like gifts. Healing works in strange ways. Sometimes nothing changes around you. Only the way you see it. That realization became even clearer several weeks later when I received an unexpected phone call from Marin. We hadn't spoken directly since her move. Most communication occurred through attorneys and written correspondence. That arrangement suited both of us. The moment I saw her name on my phone, I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered, "Hello." A brief silence followed. Then she spoke. I was in the neighborhood. I already knew where this conversation was heading. I see. Another pause. I wondered if we could talk. There was a time when those words would have filled me with hope. Not anymore. Experience had taught me something important. A conversation only matters if both people are willing to tell the truth. Still, I agreed. The following afternoon, Marin arrived. The meeting took place on the front porch. Not inside. That decision was intentional. Boundaries matter, especially after they've been ignored for years. When she stepped out of her car, I immediately noticed how different she looked. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence that once bordered on entitlement seemed diminished. Life had a way of doing that. We sat facing each other. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then she finally broke the silence. I didn't think Mom would do that. There it was. Not an apology. Not exactly, but closer to honesty than anything I'd heard from her before. I nodded. I know. She looked toward the garden. Everyone always assumed the house would be mine. The statement sounded painfully familiar. Assumptions. Again, always assumptions? I know that too. She laughed quietly. A sad laugh. Maybe I assumed it more than anyone. That was probably true. For the first time in years, she seemed capable of recognizing it. The conversation continued slowly, carefully, without accusations, without shouting, without pretending. At one point she admitted something that explained more than she probably realized. She said she spent most of her life believing she deserved things simply because people told her she did. The observation surprised me. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was self-aware. Growth rarely happens in dramatic moments. Sometimes it appears in uncomfortable honesty. That afternoon contained a little of both. Eventually, the topic everyone expected finally arrived. Can you forgive me? The question hung between us. For a long moment, I said nothing. Because forgiveness is often misunderstood. People treat it like a transaction, an obligation, a requirement for healing. I didn't see it that way. I don't hate you, I said. That much was true. Anger had faded months earlier. Exhaustion had faded too. What remained was clarity. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Marin lowered her eyes. I think she already knew that. Some relationships survive betrayal. Others survive only as memories. The truth is that trust, once broken, rarely returns in its original form. And pretending otherwise helps nobody. By the time she left, we had reached an understanding, not reconciliation, not a happy ending, an understanding. Sometimes that is enough. After her car disappeared down the street, I remained on the porch for several minutes, thinking, reflecting, breathing. The conversation felt important. Not because it repaired everything, because it confirmed something. I no longer needed approval, not from Marin, not from relatives, not from anyone. For most of my life, I quietly hoped that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved enough, people would eventually recognize my value. The deed changed that, not because it gave me property, because it forced me to recognize my own value first. Several weeks later, I began renovating small parts of the house. Nothing dramatic, fresh paint, new landscaping, minor repairs. The goal wasn't transformation. The house had already been transformed. One afternoon while organizing old photographs, I found an image of my mother standing beside my grandmother on the front steps. Both were smiling. Both looked happy. I framed the picture and placed it near the entryway. Not as a reminder of loss, as a reminder of truth. The women in that photograph understood something my family spent years ignoring. Love and responsibility matter. Commitment matters. Character matters. And eventually, truth matters too. Months later, visitors often asked how it felt to finally own the house. The question always made me smile. Because ownership wasn't the feeling that stayed with me. Peace was. The house represented something larger than property. Larger than inheritance. Larger than family conflict. It represented recognition. For years, my efforts happened quietly. For years, they were overlooked. Then one document changed everything. Not because it created the truth, because it revealed it. In the end, the deed proved something far more important than ownership. It proved that sacrifice is not always invisible, that loyalty is not always forgotten, that truth can survive years of assumptions, and that sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the loudest one. It's the person who quietly keeps going until the facts finally speak for themselves. As the evening sun settled across the front lawn, I stood on the porch and looked out at the place that had witnessed every chapter of my life. The battles were over. The questions were answered. The boundaries were clear. And for the first time since my mother's death, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: home.